So Todd can tell us everything about everyone's favorite German director.
So that everything comes with an asterisk, because one of the biggest hurdles I came across as I started laying this out was realizing this is a man who has been working since the 1960s. He has done an extensive feature filmography, an extensive documentary filmography, and I've only got an hour. So let's call this the fillet of Herzog. There are several titles which I'm only going to be able to name drop because I couldn't get them all in here. Having said that, everyone, welcome to Werner Herzog, the man, the movies, the madness. And since Liz had asked this before the program started, the madness is so much more than just his weird friendship with Klaus Kinski, although we will be touching on that as well. Introductions. So I suppose I should probably start off with my own personal introduction to Herzog. I will admit, I kind of got there late in the game. I first got introduced to him in a film studies class I took in college, where one of the films the professor showed us was his 1972 classic, Agira, The Wrath of God. I went in knowing nothing about it other than it was directed by Werner Herzog and it was starring Klaus Kinski. I was floored by what I saw on there. Not like it, this is shocking, but it is an engrossing exploration of obsession, madness, and honestly, a lot of themes that we'll be touching on in one of these upcoming slides, just a lot of the themes that make up Herzog's work as a whole. But after that, I didn't immediately go diving into his work. It was like he was on my radar. Next came a few years later for Halloween. I watched his remake of Nosferatu, and from there it just turned into, okay, this is now a name where I see him in Task and say, now we're talking. That led to Cave of Forgotten Dreams. It led to some more of his documentary work. And finally, this project turned into shoving my face into a pile of Herzog and inhaling deeply. Which I will say as much up front. There aren't a lot of his titles available in the library network, but a surprising amount are available for streaming. Like the better part of his first 2 decades of feature film output is available on Tubi right now, with the proviso that you will have to sit through ads, and you will have no warning when they will come up. But the films worth seeking out. Most of his stuff is going to be at least somewhat easy to track down. There is one I will touch on later where I don't know why, for some reason, it is hard to find. The closest I've found any answer is Herzog himself doesn't feel particularly attached to it, so that may just be like, because they can't get him to necessarily contribute extras to it as readily, they have decided it's not worth actually trying to seek out. Anyway, let's move on to this delightful Hello with the Parrots. Werner Herzog, as you can see, born in 1942 in Munich, and as you can guess by that timeline, that's a real iffy time to be growing up in Germany. When he was months old, his family basically up and relocated to Bavaria, in part because one of their neighbors' houses was blown up in an Allied bombing raid. They wisely concluded this is not a safe place to raise a child. And I stress the use of the word remote there. He describes his early years of childhood as basically being like kind of anarchic by design. His father was nowhere to be found. They were basically in it was a situation where they didn't have a lot of amenities to work off. The exact words he used were, there were no toys, there were no tools. I double check. Yeah, they didn't even have running water for a while there. This was it kind of explains a lot about how he's grown up. He basically he finally actually went back to Munich when he was 12. By that point, a lot of his early development had kind of influenced him in ways. He actually had never even seen films for the better part of his early years until just a random projectionist came into town one day and started showing them. He went through a brief religious phase in like his early teens, which partially was one of the things that let him decide he was going to become a filmmaker. True to what you'd expect from Herzog, his first film he made with a stolen camera. He swiped it from the film school that he was studying at, and he just figured like, yeah, no, this is what I gotta do. I'll do it. And as far as seeking out some of his stuff goes, you can actually find many of his early short films are available on YouTube. Many, but not all. There is one called A Game in the Sand he never officially released. And based off of quotes I could find, it sounds like this is a case where he kind of looked back at it and went, I think I went a little too far on this one for reasons that will come up in an upcoming slide. We're not talking like there was a crime committed per se, but there's certain things that went, I may have gone a little overboard.
So nothing John Landis level.
Oh, no. I can't say there haven't been fatalities on Herzog sets, but it's never been like on the level of a John Landis, oh crap, I just killed my stars because my reach overexceeded my grasp. Like, again, he's never actually had to go to court over some of this. It was just other people's personal stuff happened behind the scenes. Which actually, that I will put that recommendation out there now. There is a book in the library network called Conquest of the Useless. It is a published collection of the diaries from his work at the years he spent producing Fitzcarraldo. It is, if you're looking for a story about the making a film, this isn't the book for you. But it is just as a slice of his life and some of the weirdness that went on behind the scenes of getting that movie off the ground, it's a fascinating read. And yet, once he actually started taking off, he became one of the early standout new German filmmakers alongside Werner Fassbinder. And a lot of their early work, it was the mix of documentaries and feature. They often kind of blurred the line with some of that, which again, that's going to become a signature for Herzog we'll be touching on. And this last note here, which likewise we'll come back to, besides being a filmmaker, he's kind of one of those filmmakers you could almost say is a modern day Renaissance man. He writes, he directs. He's done an extensive amount of opera in multiple countries. Actually, he recently published a book that was itself the product of his work getting talked to doing an opera in Japan. Again, we'll touch on that later. And in terms of Herzog as a filmmaker, so as you can see here, he's very much, he openly kind of, I wouldn't say he scorns traditional style, but he is very much a much more free-form filmmaker. A lot of his stuff is heavily improvised. I really wish I'd saved the exact quote, but there is a quote where he has gone on record as saying he doesn't believe in doing too many takes at any given time because he feels like if you have them perform the same beats over and over again, it becomes kind of rote and you lose some of that natural air that goes in some of his on the performance.
So the opposite of Michael Cimino on Heaven's Gate.
Kind of, yeah. Like I get the sense he wouldn't quite see it that way, and he's definitely not Stanley Kubrick. I'll say that much. And one of those I didn't actually establish here, but one of the things, especially as the documentaries go, there is an interesting quote where he basically said he sees the idea of truth and facts as technically two separate things in arts. Like there are certain things where he will tweak certain aspects of a documentary, not because he's trying to tell the factual story, but he's trying to achieve some sort of truth in the artistic expression. Like one example of this is the documentary Little Dieter Needs to Fly, where he has a running thing where the focus of his documentary, Dieter Dengler, is in recounting like his POW experience. He has moments where he will, in his house, he will stop and basically kind of test his doors to make sure that they aren't locked, because it's not something he actually did, but for Herzog, it kind of helped convey that idea of like, this is a man who he escaped captivity and he never wants to get back there again. Like he would never go to the full extent of like doing a full-blown complete fabric. It's like he'll fabricate in little ways, but it's not like he will do a complete hagiography of someone or a complete smear piece. But again, it is one of those where this is his particular style. It's the very heavy improvisation, and for him, it's the documentary as much a art piece as it's him exploring someone else. The Rogue Film School, as mentioned at the bottom, that was a program he started up. And the idea was he basically got a bunch of young filmmakers, and he the entire thing was, a lot of his rules are, it's almost the opposite of, actually I can't say the opposite of, but if you ever heard of Dogma 95, he kind of goes in the opposite direction of that, where it's like he's willing to kind of blur the line. Not everything needs to be in scene organic. It's like he will let stuff grow. He'll just kind of let stuff grow. And often he will do some of the most, I can't use that word on a recorded program, but let's just go with insane, ambitious things, which we will be coming back to very shortly. I'm going to briefly go over what each of these is, and then we'll go into dig a little bit more into each one. Because again, we've only got an hour, and this is Herzog's a deep pool to be wading in. Even Dwarf Starts Small, it's not actually his first feature. His first feature is a film called Signs of Life. Again, you can find this one on Tubi. It's not bad, but I think even Dwarf Starts Small is the one where you really start to see Herzog being Herzog. It is a weird movie about, it's this island community that is entirely populated by little people. And one of them is essentially running as an administrator, and the group of them basically decide, we don't like the way you're running things. And they don't quite fully overthrow him, but they basically get him holed up in his little office, and they run roughshod over the island. Like, there's a famous set piece in it where they basically hijack a truck and set it spinning in circles until it essentially just runs out of gas. They light stuff on fire. They set the farm animals loose and throw them around. I will, again, keep that note about animals. That's going to come up again. Agira, the Wrath of God. It was the first of 5 collaborations with Klaus Kinski, which is, if anybody knows any piece of Herzog lore, this is probably one of the most famous pieces, right upside his collaboration with Errol Morris and getting shot on the BBC. Again, stick a pin in those. This, as I already addressed, honestly, this is probably one of his best movies, hands down. Kinski plays the titular character who, again, this is one of those films where it's technically based off a real-life conquistador, but Herzog very much kind of puts his own fictional spin on it. He was second in command to a doomed South American expedition where he decides he's going to take over and he's going to lead these men on the promise that we're going to find the lost city of gold. We're going to be rich. We are going to go back and we are going to run Spain. He essentially leads them on a doomsday mission where the film, you know what? I'll risk a small spoiler since the movie turns 50 this year. The film ends with him, the sole survivor, on a raft wandering down on a river in the South American jungle, muttering to himself about how he is the titular Wrath of God. He is still going to find the city. He is going to go back. He is going to show all the royals how he succeeded where everyone has failed. And he is the most powerful, unstoppable being. And he just looks up at the camera, and just the last thing he says, almost to the audience, is, "Who's with me?" And I'm going to put in a note here on this one, and this is going to also apply to a couple of the other films. If you seek this one out, there are multiple language editions on this, and if you're out wondering which version to watch, so strictly speaking, the original language version doesn't exist. They originally shot it in English because they figured that was the best way to get international distribution. But the problem is you're recording with kind of a guerrilla film crew. You don't have like huge studio equipment, and you're filming in the jungles of South America. You're not going to get great quality sound out of that. And ultimately what Herzog came back with was something where it's like, I can't use this. This is not good quality. So they recorded two separate dub tracks for it. One is in English, and that one does have Kinski dubbing over himself as the titular character Agira. The other version is a German language dub, and even though Kinski speaks German, he could not be reached for that dub, so they had somebody else cover his lines for that one. Either version you can watch either version, they're both fine, although as I understand it, Herzog himself prefers the German language dub. The one on Tubi is the English dub if you're that picky. I don't know which version the Library Network has, but I know this is one of the Herzog films that is available to be checked out. The Enigma of Kaspar Hauser was one. This is another where it's like he loosely based this off a real incident. The real life Kaspar Hauser was a man who turned up one day just on a town street with a note saying he'd been raised up for the better part of his life just in a single prison cell. He could barely speak. He was developmentally challenged is the nicest way to put it. And Herzog, he turns that into a story about this guy who, because he has had this unconventional upbringing, it kind of it kind of skews how he sees the world. It puts him in conflict with a lot of people around him. Like, he doesn't necessarily follow all the traditional societal mores. And in a lot of ways that alienates him. Like, he has developed his own weird view of the world and view of religion. And at first people are charmed by this, but there are certain points, particularly with regards to his religious views, where he kind of just starts realizing, I don't quite fit with everybody else here. It's not like he's necessarily seen as good or bad for it. It's just this is the way he turned out. It's also one of two films he did with the actor Bruno S., who is, I really wish that he could have done more work with him, because he gets two phenomenal performances out of that man. And apparently he was actually in real life had some, I feel wrong calling it developmental impairments. I don't know these specific details. I couldn't find clear answers on that. But again, he gets two they're very kind of odd, endearing, and in many ways genuinely sad performances out of this man. It's kind of a shame he couldn't get to do more work with him. Heart of Glass is basically, it's a story about this, and this is one which honestly feels creepily timely right now. It's a story about a town where their financial lifeblood is this special glass that one of their glassmiths makes. It is a crimson glass. It's their big bestseller. It's the thing that makes them who they are. And then this man dies before he can impart the secret of how he makes it to anybody else. So all of a sudden, what has been this town's pride and joy, the thing that has made them a community, it's gone, and they don't know how to cope with it. As an interesting piece of production lore goes, Herzog apparently had most of the cast, like, save for things like glass blowing, where doing this would be horrifically unsafe. He allegedly had the cast all hypnotized and performed their roles in a trance-like state, which I don't know how true that is, but it kind of showed the performances. A lot of these people are essentially, they play their parts like they're walking zombies. Like, they don't know how to function without essentially their town's lifeblood anymore. They're almost just kind of running out the clock, waiting for everything to collapse. Strozek's his follow-up film to working with Bruno S., and I go back and forth on whether I want to call this one a dark comedy or not. There's three films I'd say he comes the closest to comedy. Even Dwarf Started Small, it calls under this. Strozek is one where the titular character, Bruno Strozek, the movie ends with him leaving prison. He's about to start his new life. And he cannot function in Germany. Like, he's pushed around. He can't get work. He is in deep to criminals, and he decides he's going to go to America and get a fresh start there. As you can imagine from how I've described this man's performances, it does not end well. It reads like a very dark, sadly comedic take on the idea of the immigrant story, the American dream. And I won't spoil the ending, but holy crap, it is simultaneously both bleak, and the initial shock of it is it's hard not to laugh at. Nosferatu the Vampire this was another of his collaborations with Kinski, and it's the closest he's ever come to just making a straight up horror film. And he initially was going to make this. He started this kind of in the anniversary of when the first Nosferatu came out. He has a lot of love for that film, and he liked the idea of kind of doing it's not quite a one-to-one, it is a fairly beat-for-beat revisit, albeit with the extra. I don't think he did this out of spite, but considering the story of how we almost lost the original Nosferatu as a film to legal action by Bram Stoker's widow, there is almost an inadvertent middle finger that comes to the fact that Herzog's version, he actually restores several of the character names from the original Stoker novel that F.W. Murnau could not get the first time. So where Max Schreck in the original was Grach Orlok, Herzog's version has Kinski literally as just Count Dracula. And it's an interesting take because instead of just going like your more traditional vampire, his version of Nosferatu is presented as a plague. Like, yes, you see him drink blood and feed others, but a lot of his presence is more marked by these swarms of rats and just streets filled with dead people. Though, and again, I will say stick a pin in the rats because we'll be coming back to that one shortly. Fitzcarraldo is probably, in terms of the
Madness.
in terms of the sheer insane ambition of Herzog as a filmmaker, this is probably the film that gets the best. And like besides Conquest of the Useless, there is also the documentary Burden of Dreams that touches on this movie. This is a movie he had been trying to make for years. It is another case of he takes a real life person and he stretches it in its own fictional narrative. Kinski plays the man Brian Sweeney Fitzgerald, a man who has the ambition he wants to build an opera house in the South American jungle. Yeah, you heard that right. And he basically he goes through the steps like he starts up a rubber empire to get the money to do this. And probably the most famous thing about this movie is its big set piece, which of course it's kind of a fabrication because apparently the real Fitzgerald, so to put this into context, the most famous sequence of this movie involves hauling a large size ship over a mountain to get from one river to another rather than trying to navigate it the long way or ford it around. Herzog didn't use miniatures. Herzog didn't use special effects. He actually had his film crew go out to the jungle, carve out a path, and find a way with pulleys and winches to haul a full-size ship over a mountain in the South American jungle to get it from one river to the other. And it's very much in keeping with his shared themes of just massive ambition that often overexceeds grasp and man versus nature. That this is all Herzog's idea. The real Brian Sweeney Fitzgerald eventually had the ship dismantled and brought over piece by piece and built on the other side. Herzog went the extra mile and he went through the whole thing. It's why I would recommend actually reading Conquest of the Useless or check out Burden of Dreams, because the background story of this film is honestly, at points, it's more fascinating than the finished film. The finished film is good. I don't think it's Herzog's best, but if nothing else, it is commendable for the sheer over the top. He goes for it. And after this, he kind of goes through a period where he's working with other countries. He does a film about, it's like he does films in Australia, America. The one other film which I wanted to really highlight from these later years, like, because a lot of his later stuff, it does well in the films. It's like they do well in the film festival circuit. Not everyone necessarily gets quite the same level of classic status as like a lot of his early work, but they're generally well regarded. I think Roger Ebert put it best when it's like, even Herzog's failures are still fascinating movies. Out of his latter day stuff, the one that really stands out, as I gotta give it a shout out, is Bad Lieutenant, Port of Call, New Orleans. The only time he's ever worked with Nicolas Cage, although, again, I think Roger Ebert put it best, these two were made for each other. It is the one other time where you could argue he has made a comedy, and it is unhinged. And for the record, no, you do not need to see Abel Ferrara's film Bad Lieutenant to see this one. They are unrelated features. Apparently, several people involved had never seen Abel Ferrara's film before that. And Ferrara, for a while there, he hated Herzog for that. Like, he basically thought this man was like ripping him off. He took it very personally. And for a while there, he was ready to kill the guy. They apparently did finally settle. They're at peace now. And there are other future films that did not make this slide, which I would still recommend. My Son, What Have Ye Done is another great one he did later on. Where the Green Ants Dream is, it's flawed, but it's interesting. Again, there is really nothing I could come out the other side of saying, don't watch this. Like, Invincible is another I'd say it's worth looking up, but it's not necessarily like a beat down the door to see it. If nothing else, Tim Roth's performance in it is worth seeing. The one film I would warn about, there is more because it's going to be hard to find this. One film I tracked down for this is called Scream of Stone. It's a film he did roughly around 1990. It's Donald Sutherland, Brad Dourif. It's an interesting film about two mountain climbers. Well, one's a professional mountain climber. The other is a professional rock climber athlete type who one day they essentially decide they're going to they build up a rivalry. And at the heart of this rivalry is a singular treacherous mountain peak where each of them is vowing, I'm going to be the first one to reach the summit on this. Herzog never really considered it entirely his film, even though he wrote it, he directed it. It's not like it was taken from him. He has never been overridden by a studio on this. It's just one where he looks at the finished product and it's like he doesn't really feel like this is the film he wanted to make. And I think that's part of why it's so hard to find. The copy I did manage to find was a digital rip of a VHS with Spanish subtitles. I have looked trying to find other copies since just for the sake of saying this is where you can see it. The only link I found was for the website Mubi, and even then they said it wasn't available at this time. And he is still making feature films. His last feature film was in 2019. Was the film? I have to make sure I get the title right here. Please bear with me for a moment. Been a lot of digging around. It's like Family Romance LLC was a film he did. Was the last film he did. At least the last feature film. He is still making documentaries alongside that. Well, I want to make sure I have that title right for you.
Do you mean to check?
Okay, yes, that was Family Romance LLC in 2019. And yes, as I said, probably one of the most famous periods for Herzog was the 5-picture collaboration he did with Klaus Kinski. Klaus Kinski is an interesting person. Over the course of his career, he acted in, I want to say it was like over 100 films. He is a very charismatic, engaging performer. He is also, for every story you hear, a complete pain in the backside. Mercurial, temperamental, violent to an extreme at points. And even Herzog got really tired of him at points, even while they were still on good terms. And there's actually a documentary which we'll be touching back on this, but
didn't he like almost pay someone to shoot Klaus Kinski while they were filming Fitzcarraldo, or?
Oh no, he threatened to do that himself, and that was actually on the set of Agira.
Okay.
And as the story goes, as he recounts it in the documentary My Best Fiend, he had a rifle with 9 rounds in it. As he told Kinski, I'm going to put 8 of these rounds in you, and then the last one's going in my head. Interestingly enough, despite this, the stories that he allegedly made Kinski perform at gunpoint are fabricated, or at least as far as Herzog tells it. But yes, at one point he basically said, "I will." He essentially did tell him, "I will kill you if you try to leave this set." And yeah, this one was where Conquest of the Useless as a read kind of fills some of this in a bit more, because he frequently refers to Kinski in that book as very temperamental, a prima donna. Honestly, kind of, it's like there's several points where he basically kind of calls him out as a man who is very full of himself. And so this comes with the documentary, the idea of like, he wants to convey an image, but he is not necessarily the person he's trying to convey himself as. Despite this, he also recognized like he's a very engaging performer, and that's why he kept working. It was like, I like what this guy does, although he was the first to admit he doesn't shy away from the fact the man could be an absolute monster at points. Again, there is a bit in Conquest of the Useless where before he hired him to work on Fitzcarraldo, like just he was down in the jungle for another job entirely. He discusses secondhand knowledge of Kinski violently beating his wife. He doesn't go into like super detail about it, but there is a passage that still kind of sticks to me where he mentions someone having to go in and wipe blood off the walls, which tells you this man was a monster. There is no nice way to put it.
There actually, to back that up, Nastasia Kinski, if you're not familiar with her, she actually really good actress. I think better than people gave her credit for. I think she was dismissed as a pretty face, where she was actually, I think, very talented. But she was in Tass, Paul Schrader's Cat People, Paris, Texas. So she's Klaus Kinski's daughter, and she recounts, I can pull up some quotes here. She's called her father a tyrant, and basically he wasn't really a part of her life after she was 10, but according to her, she was like, it was terrifying. I believe 99% of the time I was terrified of him. He was so unpredictable that the family lived in constant terror. Klaus Kinski's other daughter, Pola, about almost 20 years after he died, said that he sexually abused her, something that Nastasia confirmed. And I actually do love this quote from Nastasia, because I'm like, wow, she is not playing around at all. Just when someone asked her, she goes, I would do anything to put him behind bars for life if he were alive. And then she just ended by saying, I'm glad he's no longer alive. So yeah.
So the really sad thing is, despite all this, genuinely horrific behavior. I don't know if Herzog at the time ever knew about those allegations or learned about that fact. I couldn't find a singular specific quote for that. But ultimately, one of the things that kind of caused them to fall apart, it was a two-stepper where their interests started to skew around the time they were making their final collaboration, Cobra Verde, which it's an interest again. It's even as it's not one of his best, but it's still an interesting movie. But part of what really started to set them off was the fact that Kinski got very demanding, very verbally abusive to some of the other people working with him. And Herzog's cinematographer on that film, who was a man he had worked with several times before that, he finally just quit because he's like, I can't deal with this man anymore. I'm done. And as far as I could tell, that cinematographer never worked with Herzog again after that, which I don't know if that was amicable between them, or it was just all the abuse from Kinski was that much he just considered the bridge fully burned. But there was, between that and the fact that Kinski kept trying to get a project off the ground of his own, which he wanted Herzog to direct. He first pitched him the script for it back when they were working on Fitzgeraldo. He took a look at the script and was like, I have no interest in this. This is not a good, I don't think this is a good script. He felt it was a very self-indulgent movie. I have to double check who that is. It was a biopic he wanted to. I have to double check who that was with. Just going through my notes quickly. Sorry. But it was he initially wanted Herzog to direct it. Herzog, he thought the script was unfilmable. He could not do anything with it. And the fact that he kept it was about violinist Niccolo Paganini. And the fact that he turned it down kind of became part of the rift between them. Like, Kinski kept pursuing it, and Herzog decided he wanted to work on his own things instead. But yeah, there is something to be said for the idea that, especially nowadays, it's like if a director wants a talent enough, they will overlook a lot of monstrous behavior. But the second you start proving too difficult to work with, that is what will kill your career faster than anything. And yeah, Kinski got a lot of work, but there was a lot of directors who, likewise, that was a one and done because they could not work with this guy for long after that.
I think to have like some semblance of fairness, and it's mainly speculation, but there are a lot of people who are like, Klaus Kinski likely, and this does not excuse the thing he did, had some untreated mental illness, like potentially bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and again, does not excuse what he did, but at the very least, it could explain some of the more erratic on-set behavior.
And again, it's one of those where Herzog recognized he was a talented person, and but even then, even during their quote unquote good years, they fought constantly, and he does not shy away from a lot of that. Nor does Kinski, because apparently he published a memoir, which in the documentary My Best Fiend, Herzog discusses how he's portrayed in that memoir, which he openly admits he thinks a lot of that book is bunk. But yeah, Kinski did not speak favorably of him in that. Which is funny considering of the two, his documentary is, I won't say it necessarily puts the man on a pedestal, but he feels a bit more forgiving of Kinski than vice versa. But of course, Kinski wasn't the only sore spot as far as Herzog's career goes. One of the things I kind of touched on before, he's been the subject of if you're sensitive to the idea of animal abuse, some of Herzog's stuff can be kind of difficult to watch. Like, Even Dwarf Started Small is one where if you're sensitive to seeing animals mishandled, there are several cases in that film where it looks like there's animals being manhandled on screen. There's chickens being swung around who are presumably not enjoying themselves. There is a dead pig in that film where I'm still not entirely clear if they just happened to have a dead pig on set or if they killed the pig themselves. But probably one of the most infamous of these is from the set of Nosferatu, where again considering the vampire scene is endemic of the plague, one of the things Herzog got was he got a lot of rats involved. And some of the way the rats were handled, one of the handlers objected strongly to, because he did a process where a lot of the rats essentially had their fur dyed, and several of them were essentially killed in the dyeing process. Yeah, that the person involved was like, yeah, no, I can't endorse this. This was unacceptable. And one of the other items that came up is in the production have a film he did in the 80s called Where the Green Ants Dream. It was a film he did. It's like a lot of films, it kind of mixes fact and fiction. It's loosely based off a real life land dispute between some of the Aboriginals in Australia and a construction company that was working their land there. As the film presents it, the idea is the construction company's coming in and they're trying to work in this area where, as the Aborigines are objecting, they think there is a group of green ants, dream ants, that are essentially dormant under the ground. If the construction crew comes in and unearths this, they'll wake up and the world will end. And they actually go to court over this. It's not necessarily his best film, but it's interesting. You can see, if you're a fan of Mad Max, you get to see Bruce Spence in a straightforward role in that, as well as a brief appearance by why is like Hugh Keys-Byrne. He's not as huge in the film. It's like, if you may remember him more from like either the first or fourth Mad Max films.
Toe Cutter and Morton Joe specifically.
Yeah. And overall, the film actually got him. There were people in Australia who did not like the way he depicted the Australian government, to the point where one broadcaster actually published an article entitled, and I quote, "Damn it, Herzog, you're a liar." Like they felt like the Australian government was not being depicted as fair. The film definitely is a little bit more on the side of the Aborigines. Like, it's told from Bruce Spence's character's perspective, and at first he is just kind of like this his desk guy working at the construction site who looks and goes, "Okay, I'll hear these natives out, see what they want, and maybe we can make a deal with them." And he starts getting more involved in their case, to the point where when they ultimately wind up losing it, he is furious because he feels like he let them down. It's like, I kind of promised these people we could get this done, and this is how we repay them. I don't know if anybody necessarily has that one for release right now. I found a copy of it up on YouTube, which again, it's worth checking out. But yeah, that was seen as initially as a misstep at the time, but even then, it's a fascinating misstep for him. And those were like the main controversy points I found. There's been minor disputes over some of the factual issues. Some things like the movie Rescue Dawn it didn't have as big, but there was some pushback over the fact that, again, that's loosely it is based off the life of Dieter Dengler, who was a Vietnamese POW. And some of the other people who he was imprisoned with and later escaped, they disputed how they were presented in the film. It wasn't to the full-blown level of, say, again, publishing an article where they flat out said, "You're a liar," or Herzog. But again, it goes into what we discussed actually with last month's program, where a lot of times films based off a true story will have liberties taken, and not everybody will be happy with the liberties in question. But those are the two big ones, were the animal abuse and, you've done something special when you get a country's government mad at you.
Just like that episode of The Simpsons.
Yeah, Werner beat Bart Simpson to that punch.
Also, and I don't want to excuse animal abuse, and I'm clearly not, but it is some of that like retrospective, or is it like at the time controversial? Because animal welfare in films is still ultimately a fairly new thing. It's
a little of both. I kind of file even Dwarf Star and Smalls in a similar camp, something like Pink Flamingos, where you get the sense part of it's an indie set, so you can't really get an animal handler for some of this. Like Fitzgeraldo, they had several animals die behind the scenes, where some of that you just get the sense in general the conditions they were filming in were rough on everyone, and it took toll on animal and person alike with some of that. Because again, there were people who died on the set of that as well, not in like a reckless, negligent way, but it was more of those are the conditions they were working in. Funny enough, there was a close call they had with one of the people they had doing clearing out of some of the jungle. There, man got bitten in the foot by a poisonous snake, and as Herzog kind of recounts it, had he been left to his own devices, he'd have been dead, because the poison would have killed him in 5 minutes. The people who could have treated at the camp were 20 minutes away. This guy thought quickly. He chainsawed off his own foot to stop the venom from getting to his heart.
Oh boy.
Hey, he survived.
Uh,
I mean, it wasn't like he was doing this entirely solo. His decision to cut off his own foot was his own idea, but other people jumped in. They tourniqueted his leg. They got him back to camp okay.
all right.
Yeah. The documentary this is where I'll admit, I didn't get to go as deep into the zoo as I'd have liked because his feature film output's like a good 20 movies. His documentary output is even longer. The man is a celebrated documentarian for a reason. And as you already touched on, a lot of the films on this list, there is kind of for him, it's the art first, the factuality of it comes in second. And again, he never actually goes to the point of like making wide, broad, inaccurate statements for a lot of it. He still ultimately he's exploring a particular theme with this, like Land of Silence and Darkness. It's him looking at people who essentially they live their lives in a state of as it's mutual blindness and deafness, which there's honestly, even early on, it's like there's some emotionally hard-hitting moments that early on because one of the first people they kind of cover, she wasn't born that way. And she talks about like she still kind of has memories of colors, of sensations. And it's man, just that alone is kind of oof. That's something which you can find up on YouTube. I think Shadow Factory might actually have them out because they have been getting a lot of his early work. Lessons of Darkness is one I marked with an asterisk because it's one of 3 films that he's done. The other 2 are Fata Morgana and The Wild Blue Yonder, where he really blurs that line between documentary and feature film. It's the idea of the footage is almost predominantly all documentary, but he kind of recuts it in a way where there's a separate sort of narrative to it. Like Fata Morgana, it's all footage of like the Sahara Desert, and he kind of sets it up against a narrative of I want to say it's a Mayan creation myth. I just double check that. Lessons of Darkness, it is a 15-minute documentary about it's all footage taken from the first Kuwait War and specifically from the oil fields that got lit ablaze in the conflict. And he kind of presents it the way it's narrated. He's almost speaking of it like it's an alien world. He never mentions specific countries. It is just, it starts off talking about this is the land, then the war happened. And it's all presented in broad strokes. And even then, he still has these little bits stick around it. Like there is a segment in there where they're discussing people who were tortured under Saddam's regime. Like there's one segment where it starts off with just it's a row of essentially confiscated equipment used for torture, and then this one recounting like how her son was basically beaten and tormented by soldiers. But a lot of it is literally just it's him focusing on this footage of like the destruction of the oil fields, just the devastation. And there is he actually got criticized at the time because people thought like he's kind of aestheticizing war. He's making it look beautiful. And there is a sort of beauty to it, but it is genuinely haunting to look at. It's more like, because again, you were still looking at this like this, you're still seeing devastation. This is wreckage. This is aftermath of a war. I mean, granted, again, that's one of those weird, fascinating things about Herzog is very rarely do you see him come away with something of a full-blown contempt. Like even things that we would find contemptible, he tries to find like he almost has a genuine fascination with. He never actually will like make a project expressly to slander something. If he's feeling something, it's because it interests him.
I mean, look at Grizzly Man.
Oh, we'll be coming to Grizzly Man. Do not worry. Little Dieter Needs to Fly. Again, I've kind of touched on this one. It's a kind of a two-hander because he tells the story of Dieter Dengler again, both in this and in the feature film Rescue Dawn. It's 2 different sides of the same story. Rescue Dawn is much more focused on the actual time on the ground as a POW and trying to escape from that. Little Dieter Needs to Fly. It recounts that, and in some ways, it almost goes to more graphic descriptions of the tortures that were inflicted on him. But it's also the man after the fact and how his time as a prisoner has kind of affected him, as well as kind of looking at who he was before the war as this. And throughout it, as the title suggests, it's this man who has always, his big thing was he wanted to fly. He wanted to be a pilot. That's the entire reason he got mixed up in the war in the first place, it was his opportunity to learn how to be a pilot. Of the two, I'd say they're both receiving, but I think Little Dieter Needs to Fly is the stronger of the two to watch. My Best Fiend, again, we've already touched on a lot of his relationship with Klaus Kinski, and that is him kind of reflecting on that in documentary form. It's fascinating because he does not shy away from the fact that, yeah, he gave as well as he got in a lot of that. There's segments of that film which it's literally behind the scenes footage of him getting into shouting matches with Kinski. That's actually where that's the snapshot earlier of him saying, I don't care how Bertolt Brecht or David Lean do this from, like, that was him responding to one of Kinski's blowouts, because essentially him going, I don't care how they do it, this is how we're doing it. And for as much as there are several points in that film where he talks up Kinski as either being like kind of a poser, very full of himself, prima donna, he still has a weird sort of affection with him. It's like there are even people he talks to where it's like these people actually genuinely had good memories of him. So he's not trying to make it out like this was this jerk I worked with. It's there's almost a sense of, yes, I acknowledge this man could be an absolute brute, but this is also, I want you to see, this is what I found fascinating. This is the person I wanted to work with. Grizzly Man is probably his most famous documentary for reasons. It tells the story of Tim Treadwell, a man who he was fascinated by grizzly bears. Like he would go out into the forest and he would film himself basically studying, watching over, protecting these bears. If you've never seen this movie before, it's documentaries, it's not really a spoiler. The film actually establishes very early on, Tim Treadwell was killed by a bear. He and his girlfriend were killed and eaten by a bear, and he establishes this like early on into the film. And it's honestly, that's kind of one of those things which becomes a running thread throughout that documentary. It's like he's looking at why this man had this fascination with animals, and there is kind of a question of, was he naive? Did he kind of have too much of a soft vision of nature, which that actually, it makes an interesting counterpoint to Herzog himself, who he's frequently seen nature as kind of, he doesn't dislike nature. He actually finds it very beautiful, but he is also one of the first people to admit, in many ways, nature can be very cruel. It can be very ruthless. There is a quote he had around the time he was working on Fitzgerald, where he described the South American jungles as full of chaos and murder, which he's not wrong about. Nature can be very ruthless in a lot of ways. And in that regard, he kind of digs into that with the Grizzly Man, with that sense of, did this guy really just bite off more than he could chew? And he really because there's a lot of footage in there where it's like, it's him speaking of all these animals, like they're very friendly and very outgoing. Even as Herzog contrasts this with video of like bears wrestling. And if you've ever seen bears wrestle, it's rough footage. Like, you see fur flying off of them. You see them smacking each other around. And in the middle of this, one of the things which is kind of an interesting point of contention is, so Treadwell's death was technically filmed. The lens cap was on the camera, but the audio is there. And probably the scene that most people famously know about this is, there is a moment when he is with Treadwell's ex-wife, and he is listening to the audio of that final night. You see him from behind with the headphones on. You're kind of seeing like half of a pained expression on his face. He takes off the headphones and he just looks at her and tells her, don't listen to this. Never listen to this. At the time, he told her, you should destroy this tape, but she ultimately couldn't bring herself to do it. It is sitting in a lockbox somewhere. It's in a bank deposits. And no one has listened to it since, but it's like, they kind of want to preserve that memory, but they also recognize they're not going to put this out there for general consumption, because it's the sound of two people being violently killed by a bear. And that's not the legacy Treadwell would want to be remembered for. Encounters at the End of the World, by comparison, is a bit less grim. That's one where it's a nature documentary in Antarctica. And again, it's his fascination with nature, where he doesn't softball it. He doesn't try and put it through rose-colored glasses, but he has a genuine respect and admiration for the beauty of the natural world. Cave of Forgotten Dreams, I will say this much up front. I'm kind of an agnostic where it comes to the 3D boom that some of us may remember from the late 2000s into the mid 2010s. I think this is one of those films that did make good use of it, because for anybody who isn't familiar with the story, this was there was a group working in a mountain pass where they managed to find, it was a cave filled with old cave drawings. They had basically been completely sealed up, cut off from the rest of the world. And they actually got the permission for Herzog to send a camera in on a remote and basically be the person to try and film and document a lot of these ancient cave drawings. And so he and his crew went in. They actually did this in 3D with this remote camera. If you can ever find like a repertory of this screening, it is well worth seeing in a theater because it is genuinely very engaging and very powerful stuff. And part of it's also, this was a film that's part of he even acknowledged at the time, we're never going to see this again, because at the time they were finishing filming, they were realizing like, because we've opened this up, we're starting to expose these paintings to the elements. So we're going to have to pull out, we're going to seal this up. We can, the only way we can actually save these is we're going to close this up again. We can't, this is going to be the last any people in our lifetime are probably ever going to see these paintings. Into the Abyss, despite what you might think based on these last two, it's not a nature documentary. It's a documentary he did essentially about the death penalty, where it's probably one of the ones he is least directly involved in. Like, he's not an on-screen presence for as much of it, but it is basically looking at an inmate during his final days before his execution. And this wasn't quite controversy per se, but this, at the time this came out, this did become a flashpoint because, yeah, there was a lot to be said about the entire question of the death penalty in America at that point, and this documentary further added to that. Again, he is with it. I'm double checking to see when the last documentaries, because he is still working. Actually, he has a documentary on slate for this year called The Fire Within, which actually, wait a minute, that's the name right? 1 second, I am double checking this because I had missed this name before. Please bear with me for a moment. So funny enough, the documentary Fire of Love that's out now about the two volcanologists, Katya and Maurice Kraft.
Yeah.
Herzog is doing another documentary about them around the same time. So they're getting two documentaries in the same year.
That's awesome. I need to see them both now.
And actually, that's the second time he's touched on them, because he did an earlier, he did a documentary 2 years ago called Into the Inferno, where he addresses them. So.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, he is still keeping busy, which actually kind of comes to where we go with this next. Alongside being an acclaimed director, in recent years, he's been building up kind of a reputation as an actor for other directors. Like, one of the other big name roles he was known for was he did appearance in one of the Jack Reacher films, because they expressly wanted Werner Herzog specifically for this. And for him, it's work. It's something he likes doing, and especially he does both live. It's like, as you can see here, he's also done voiceover work, which if you've ever heard him talk, you can understand why. He has a very deep, he's got a voice of gravitas to it, and actually a presence with it, which actually also goes with the two roles we're picturing here, which are just two samplings. I'll admit I have not seen much of The Mandalorian, but what I saw of him as just this character they refer to as the client, it's a good performance, because Herzog, he's one of those guys where even if it's something like Star Wars, we could look and go, I don't understand what a lot of this is, he'll still bring his gravitas to it. He makes an engaging antagonistic character out of it. And yes, some people may remember he is the guy who famously got them to stick to using the puppet net because they were talking about doing CG, and he basically derided them as cowards for it. The role on the left is actually, of the voiceover work that Herzog has done, I felt like this is probably the best pick, because he's done work on other things like American Dad. He's done spots on Rick and Morty, Metalocalypse. And here he did a performance in Hayao Miyazaki's, currently his final film, which talk he's making he did a performance in the English dub for The Movie The Wind Rises, which, besides the fact that character design actually kind of looks like him entirely by chance. Like, as far as I know, I don't think they specifically intended to have Herzog do the English dub for him, but I could be wrong. It's a character that kind of feels fitting for him, because he's playing a German expat who is living in Japan in the lead up to World War II. He fled his own country because of where he saw it was going. And his character kind of serves as a counterpoint to the protagonist looking and going, so I recognize where my country is at. Look around you. Do you think you like where your country is going? And again, he brings a lot just by his presence there. But even then, it's not like he is just sleepwalking through these performances. He still brings a lot to them. It's not the biggest part of his career, but I felt like given he has one of those very much, if you see him think it's oh crap, it's him. I felt like we need to give a shout out to his work as a performer. And then there was just Herzog himself as a media figure, which honestly nowadays, this is probably where people will most famously know him. Is just he is a figure who is almost transcends his film work to become just this wonderfully strange man with this very distinct German voice. As we discussed earlier, I mean, some of the stories we've already discussed, things like the fact that he was doing an interview for the BBC where he was famously shot with a BB rifle, and the interviewer was right to stop. He's like, no, it's fine, I can keep going, and he kept going through the entire interview with just, because he even looked like, it's a little bit of blood, this is no problem, I can keep doing this. The shot here is actually from a famous short film called Werner Herzog Eats His Shoe, which the context on this story is early on in his career, he built up a friendship with documentarian Errol Morris. Errol Morris, if you may recognize him from films like Gates of Heaven, The Thin Blue Line, he's a very well-regarded documentarian. At the time, he was still working on Gates of Heaven, which would turn out to be his breakout film. And Herzog kind of gave him a wager. He basically put it as like, if you finish this film, I will personally eat a shoe. Morris completes Gates of Heaven. It becomes a huge hit. It makes him a name. And Herzog basically decides, you know what? A deal's a deal. I agreed to this. And he makes an event of it. Like, there is a short film. If you ever find the Criterion for the movie, it would be Burden of Dreams. They have this on there as a bonus shorts. And it's like they actually had a stage event. And it's great because they do the lead up to this where you see him. He selected the boot in question. He is putting it in a pot. He is garnishing this thing with vegetables. He is putting it over the broth. He is basically deciding, if I'm going to do this, I'm not just going to chew leather. I'm going to give this thing some flavor. I'm going to give this thing some taste. And then before a stage, answering questions and answers, he sits down with a knife and fork. He starts carving up this shoe and eating this boiled flavored shoe leather as he's answering questions. It sounds strange, but he makes it a genuinely engaging thing to watch. And again, he's as a media figure, you can find all sorts of weird stories about him. Probably one of my other personal favorites. And if you don't mind the profanity, I would wholeheartedly recommend looking this up. There is a video of him on YouTube at the New York Museum of Modern Art doing a live dramatic reading of the children's book, Go the F to Sleep. It is, and again, he's doing it in a very mild, very gravitas heavy way he works. And it's just, I really wish I could properly quote this, but because of the book in question, if you're familiar with it, you know why I can't. But it is genuine.
I want to hear him read the line, blank your bear, I'm not giving you blank.
That one and My Whole Life is a Lie, I'm a blank parents are probably two of the best reads of the whole thing. And alongside these, as we kind of touched on, he's a prolific writer. Several of his books are available in English. I know at least two are in the library network. They already discussed Conquest of the Useless, and one that actually came out earlier this year, his first novel, The Twilight World, which, again, like a lot of his features and documentaries, this is based off a real event. You may not recognize the person by name, but you might recognize the story. The novel is about Hiro Onoda, who was a Japanese soldier in World War II. He was stationed in the Philippines, and as they were pulling out of the Philippines, his commanding officer pulled him aside and gave him an order. You stay here. You hold this. You act as a saboteur. You basically carry out a protracted guerrilla campaign. And he did just that. He went in there he kind of over time picked up a handful of other stragglers who he kind of formed a small battalion with. And he held his post for the better part of 50 years. Like, even as some of the other people in the group, like one of them surrendered, two more were killed during failed raids, but he managed to keep this up until finally it got to the point where there were numerous attempts to try and get him to come back. They would leave out like they would leave out newspapers telling that the war was over, and every single one of these he'd look at and go, clearly this is fake. This is made by the enemy. No, clearly we are still fighting the war. We are winning. Finally, it got to the point where they had to find one of his old commanders to actually come in and go, no, really, the war is over. It's okay. You can stand down and come home now. And honestly, I would really recommend giving it a read. It's a fairly brisk book. It's only like 100-something pages. It's like 130 pages, give or take. But it's also very engaging. I blew through the whole thing in like 2 days. It's Conquest of the Useless is a bit thicker. It's going to be a bit thicker and a bit denser read because number one, it's journal entries, and number two, it's like it is him recounting those over the better part of like a 3 to 5 year span. It's 300 pages. But again, if you are interested in getting more of his insights, it's worth the read. It is a strange journey, but it's well worth it. But I would definitely recommend seek out the Twilight World. It is out there now. It's in the library network. And again, right about now, it's a good kind of intro to his work. It's him exploring this person who they're kind of taking on this larger than life task. It's man against nature. It's this person who any other sane person would have walked away, but he can't bring himself to abandon this order. So that about sums it up. If anybody has any questions, comments, complaints, recommendations, or asking for recommendations, by all means, I open the floor. Right. And yes, that screen cap is from the famous shot of his reaction hearing the death of Timothy Treadwell.
Yeah, I heard about that moment of the film before I actually saw Grizzly Man. And Grizzly Man is, I think, a very fascinating movie.
Oh, it's very good. Like, I would wholeheartedly recommend it. Just understand there's points where it's an emotionally rough movie.
It is. It's just, I just watched it thinking, you're hanging out with grizzly bears. How did you think this was going to end?
Well, that's actually, there is one of those beats that kind of stuck with me where it is him seeing he is confronted with some of the crueler sides of nature. Like, there is a beat where he sees this cub that got killed by another bear. And it's just this moment of like, there's still a sense that he doesn't want to abandon this idea that no, sometimes nature can be just as cruel as humans can, even as he gets increasingly more bitter and disillusioned with the human world, to the point where you get the sense he's ultimately resigning himself to this doomed fate because he kind of turns his back on humanity and decides, I'm going to completely commit myself to this animal cause.
Ellie, I know you are a bear expert and you lived in Alaska. What can you tell us about grizzly bears?
So part of the problem with with bears in general and grizzly bears in particular, is that people sort of look at them and they see like, oh, big fuzzy dog. To be fair, I look at them and see, oh, big fuzzy dog, because they are big fuzzy dogs who need pets. And what I understood about Treadwell from people who like knew of him, like park rangers out in that area, is that you can actually make friends with foxes out there. Like, you can actually get a actual emotional connection with a fox, and he thought he could do that with a bear. You can't. They don't give a shit about you in any direction.
Language.
Oh, sorry.
But I mean, she's not wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the long and the short. I don't know too many people who are park rangers out there. He's kind of one of those cases where he's kind of like halfway between like, well, this is something people know about our state, and like, God, I wish that wasn't what people knew about our state.
Yeah, if anything, I'd imagine he'd be more of a cautionary tale at this point.
He very much is. People you'll bring him up like, hey, you remember what happened to that dude who lived out in the bears? That's why you gotta be careful about bears.
All right. Well, Todd, you did a great presentation. And again, one day, you and Ellie, I am going to task you both with the David Lynch program.
And once again, I just want to repeat this because it's in the library network. If you're interested in checking out this man's work, Agira, the Wrath of God is available. Check it out. It's a hell of a movie.
Yeah. Fitzcarraldo's great too.
Fitzcarraldo, I think, is like, I will maintain I'm a little iffy on Whitesec and Cobra Verde. They are fascinating missteps, but the trifecta of Agira, Fitzcarraldo, and Nosferatu is well worth seeking out.
All right. Does anyone have any questions? Or if they're also Herzog fans, do they have any other recommendations? Oh, really? No one. Or actually, I'll say you can either unmute or put this in the chat. Does anyone else have a favorite Herzog film? Because I know we had at least a couple of fans coming.
I like Incident at Loch Ness.
Oh.
Which is a fake comedy horror film, fake documentary.
Is that about Nessie?
It is, and it's co-written by Zach Penn, who co-wrote The Avengers, and it's about them making a Loch Ness movie, but suddenly they want to make it a fake horror movie against Herzog's wishes, and Herzog plays himself. The cinematographer plays himself. It even has Crispin Glover in a cameo playing Crispin Glover.
I think that actually might have been the one that he was shot doing an interview for, but I'll have to double check that.
It's just fascinating knowing that he's acting as himself the whole movie.
Oh, he's done a couple of he has a brief but genuinely funny cameo in American Dad doing that, where the last 30 seconds of the episode just turns into a fake Herzog documentary.
And we'd be remiss not to mention that he saved Joaquin Phoenix's life one day after
Also,
a car
yes.
accident.
Really?
He was in a car accident, and the person who saved him was Werner Herzog.
All right.
Actually, by telling him don't light a cigarette right now.
Jeez. But yeah, I would say, I'm not as well versed in Herzog as Todd is, but at the very least, I could say Cave of Forgotten Dreams is really good. Grizzly Man is really good. Nosferatu, both versions, really good. And I really liked Fitzcarraldo. It's Fitzcarraldo, I think, is a great tribute to just madness.
Speaking of the two versions, I do need to point out, if you go seek out Nosferatu, there are technically two cuts of it available, because there was the German language version is technically the longer version. They made some time cuts for the international version. Both versions are still, Herzog kind of endorses both, but just if you're a purist who wants the most complete version, look for the German language version.
Yeah, else, I think of anything else. Does that say if no one has any other questions, we can let everyone go. I was about to say enjoy the night, but nobody is enjoying this weather at all. I can't. Know. And if you are, I don't know if I want to talk to you.
Great job,
currently
guys.
What? I'm currently dying in this weather right now.
Yeah.
Well, it's an knock, Liz.
I'm meant to live in a cool climate, so I'm not doing well here. So actually just a couple of I didn't mention up at the top some notes for our upcoming programs, because we pretty much have the rest of the year planned out. So next month, September, if you are an animation fan, I am going to be talking about Don Bluth. And I don't know if I had this planned before or after I learned that he was releasing his memoir, but I'm reading it right now, and very excited to talk about someone who I don't think he's forgotten. I think he's known a lot in the animation world, but I think for regular people who just watch children's films, I don't think they quite know who Don Bluth is anymore, or at least if they're younger, maybe if they're of a certain age. But we're doing that in October. Todd and I are doing a joint presentation called Your Body Horror and You, Body Horror 101. We actually presented a version of this years ago at Kineticon. We're bringing it back. It's also going to go hand in hand with a screening at our library of John Carpenter's The Thing. So if you want to watch that in person, come to the library. The movie, not the program. And speaking of John Carpenter, in November, Todd and I are finally going to be talking about John Carpenter. We figured now's the time. And to close out the year, we're doing something a little different. So me, Todd, Mark, who is in this presentation, and I believe may or may not be our director, Eric himself, we are all going to be talking about the 5 worst films we've ever seen. And I believe we all have 5 different movies we are going to discuss.
At this point, I think I've really locked 3, so I'll just put that out there now.
I've
there
got
are
6. I gotta get rid of 1.
Ooh, see, I have 3 locks. I'm kind of with Todd. I have 3 locks, and then there's a bunch where I'm like, I gotta narrow kind of I gotta figure out what's going in there. And there's somewhere it's like, I am just not going to put certain films in here. Like it's shooting like a movie I've seen on Mystery Science Theater 3000. I'm like, that's putting fish in a barrel.
Yeah, that's not what that's about. Yeah.
Also, this is weird. I may have to say, there's a part which is wondering, like, if this gets closed out, I might have to lower my standard because right now I'm looking at like, these are the films where it's like, a lot of them I'm leaving out because like I'm fascinated by their badness as opposed to ones where I'm like, the existence of this movie infuriates me.
Yeah, I'm almost getting to the point where the movies I'm listing, their biggest crime is they're boring. Because like I'm not putting Showgirls on there because number one, I love that movie. I wouldn't see that Showgirl. But it's also one where I'm like, even if you don't like it, it's an interesting failure.
It's gloriously bad, yes.
Yeah, whereas there's some others where I'm like, how do you screw this up?
You ask me my favorite bad movies, you're gonna get a very different 5 because that one I've already got locked.
Oh yeah. But yeah, no. So if you want to hear which are the 5 worst films we've ever laid eyes upon, join us this December. And with that, I am going to bid everyone a good night, and hopefully I will see you next month for Dawn Bluth. All right, have a good night.